Hey everybody, this is Greg Damico coming at you here. And what I want to do is try to give you a synopsis of Kant's ethical view in a relatively short lecture here. You can see I've got a picture of Kant up here. I've also got open Kant's book, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, which is the main text that sort of gets at the highlights of his view that I want to talk about in this class. And in particular, I'll be focusing on chapter one here. Okay, so first of all, Kant comes at ethics from a quite different direction from the direction that Mill approached it in. So if you recall, if you've been looking at Mill's utilitarian theory, Mill says, well, if I want to know how to act, then I need to know what's good, right? And then ethics could simply be a matter of going around maximizing or promoting whatever that good thing is. And after some hemming and hawing and some deliberation, Mill says, "Well, it's happiness. That seems like the thing that's always good, and so that's what we ought to be maximizing." Kant comes at it from a rather different direction. He says, if there's one thing I know about ethics, it's that ethics is about following rules. There are somehow, right, when it comes to acting well, when it comes to doing the right thing, there are somehow restrictions on my action. That's not to say that I'm not free to act immorally, of course, but it is to say that uh, if I am to act rightly, then there are certain things I'm not supposed to do. Um, we clearly want our ethical theory to have it at the end of the day that, for example, torturing puppies is wrong and giving to the poor is good and that sort of thing. And so there are somehow these uh, constraints or encouragements or discouragements or uh, these guidelines in place for moral behavior. Now, if Mill were right, if there were actually intrinsically good things in the world, then presumably it would be reasonable to say, well, yeah, the rules of morality just tell us to go around maximizing or promoting those intrinsically good things. Okay. But famously, Kant denies that there are intrinsically good things like that in the world. If we skip ahead to the beginning of chapter one here, you can see Kant says, nothing in the world or out of it can possibly be conceived that could be called good without qualification. Okay, so this is the kind of intrinsic good that Mill is talking about, except a good will. Okay, so there is one thing Kant says that's good, and that's a good will. He goes on, mental talents such as intelligence, wit, judgment, temperaments such as courage, resoluteness, perseverance. We might add here uh, gifts of fortune, gifts of nature, power, riches, honor, even health, the overall well-being and contentment with one's condition that we call happiness. None of those things, says Kant, is intrinsically good because they can all become extremely bad and harmful if the person's character isn't good, right? That is, if the person who has those things doesn't have a good will, if rather that person has ill will, okay? And as a sort of stark way of seeing this, right, you might think about, um, you know, when it comes to intelligence, well, intelligence is generally a good thing, um, but an intelligent villain, right, an intelligent criminal, an intelligent murderer is much worse than a stupid criminal or murderer, right? And so, in that particular narrow context of murderers, criminals, intelligence actually doesn't improve the situation at all. It makes it worse. Okay. Similarly with happiness, right? If you point out to the torturer of puppies that he's doing a terrible thing, and his response is that it makes him happy to do it, right? We don't say, well, that makes the situation better. On the contrary, we would probably say that makes it worse, right? To delight in the pain of another creature is presumably compounding the evil of the hurt in the first place. Okay. So Kant says there's nothing that's good in itself. There's a good will, but of course it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about trying to maximize that. We want, of course, to act with a good will, but that's really just the question that we started with. What is it to act well? What is it to act morally? And Kant decides, well, it's got to be somehow about following the right sort of rules. Now, it's hard to give content to those rules precisely for this same reason, right? I can't say go around maximizing happiness, go cultivate your intelligence, because those things aren't necessarily or intrinsically or without qualification good. Okay. And so, after struggling a bit to sort of decide what it is that could fill out the contents of these rules that must compose morality, right? Kant says, well, I consider laws about maximizing happiness or cultivating intelligence or gaining a bunch of money, and all those things are no good because uh, those things are simply not intrinsically good. Okay. And eventually Kant says this very famously. He says, since I have robbed the will of any impulses that could come to it from obeying any law, nothing remains to serve as a guiding principle of the will except conducts universally conforming to law as such. That is, the only thing that really remains from my idea about morality being a set of laws is this idea of lawfulness, right? That is, he clarifies, I ought never to act in such a way that I couldn't also will that the maximum on which I act should be a universal law. Okay. This, in the bold type here, that is one statement of Kant's view. This principle here is often called the categorical imperative. And the idea of imperative is that it's a command of sorts. And the idea of categorical means that it commands us unconditionally, right? It commands us to act no matter what. This is not a principle of prudence. This is not a principle that I should follow given that I'm in one particular practical situation or another. This is a principle that I'm supposed to follow at all times because of the nature of morality as such. Okay, let's read this one more time. I ought never to act in such a way that I couldn't also will that the maxim on which I act should be a universal law. And so here's where the idea of lawfulness comes in. What is it about lawfulness that's relevant to morality? Well, that's just it. I need to act as though the way I'm acting were a law, i.e., a law that everyone followed. Okay. I need to be able to act in such a way that the maxims of my actions, that is, by maxim, he just means a sort of description of my action. It includes things like the consequences of my action, and importantly, it includes my motivations, my intentions that might have seemed conspicuously absent from Mill's theory of morality, right? Um, this description of my action has to be the sort of thing that I can will to be, I can desire to be, I can want to be universal law. I must be able to will, to accept, to desire, to want that everyone in my situation, in my circumstances, act in the way that I am proposing to act. Right? If I can will that, if I can accept that, if I can actually want that, then my action is moral. Okay. So in particular here, right, there's no carving out of exceptions for myself, right? I can't, in particular, I can't go around stealing from people. Why? Well, because if I go around stealing from people, that's in effect saying that I'm okay with everyone stealing from everyone else whenever they want to, right? That would obviously lead to a tremendous breakdown of society. If we can't trust each other, then we can't very well have a society. And if we can't have a society, then we, have a sort of lawless, anarchic, brutish existence. Nobody could possibly will that state of being into existence. And so this action of stealing must be immoral.